All right, Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you again for joining us and talking with Hilda about her new book.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you as always to Bookworks, our wonderful local independent store. We are so happy to have you. And welcome all of you to this discussion, reading, and celebration of Hilda Raz's collected poems, Letter from a Place I've Never Been, which also includes new and uncollected poems. So I'd like to just say a few words about Hilda, who many of you know, of course. She is a celebrated poet, editor, critic, memoirist, teacher, longtime editor of Prairie Schooner, and now our poetry editor for Bosque Press, which Linda Miller and I put out. So we are so happy to have her and to work with her. So today we're going to talk a bit about the poems, and we're going to also read sometimes together and sometimes singly. I would just like to say one sentence from Jessie Lee Kercheval, who blurbed this book, just to start us off. To read Hilda Raz's Letter from a Place I've Never Been is to open a precious gift, to sit down to a feast celebrating a life in poetry. And indeed, Hilda, you have had and are having a life in poetry. It must feel wonderful to have this collection in your hand, the combined books of poetry written since 1986, as well as the new and unpublished poems. How did this book strike you when you first received it from Nebraska? I wonder if you felt the weight of your career in your hands.
Oh, Lynn, I certainly did. Thank you all for being here. And thanks for supporting the life that produced the poems. I'm so grateful to see you all. All right, I'm grateful for this book. It is bigger than I ever imagined it could be. It's all my books, but it also has the new and uncollected poems. And that was Kwame Dawes's idea. All the other books that I've published, I've had to go to presses to peddle, as all of us do. But Kwame Dawes came to me with the idea for this book, and he persuaded me, and then he asked me which press I would like to publish it. And I spent my career at the University of Nebraska as the editor of Prairie Schooner and a professor in the Department of English, working mostly with PhD students, some of whom I see here. So I'm very happy to have the University of Nebraska publish this, and also Karen Koch, who was my colleague at the university and a brilliant artist, allowed me to use this image for the cover of the book. And I want to mention Karen's generosity. I want to mention also John Kinsella, the Australian poet and critic, who has been a great supporter of my work. I love his work. I have never met him, but he asked to write the introduction, and Kwame said, "You mind?" I didn't mind. So he did that. I grew up with a new criticism, which says that human beings' lives as artists should not be considered in the reading of the work. And I believed that for a long time, until actually Letter from a Place I've Never Been arrived. And life, I discovered, takes us by the throat and calls us to use it. And so there are lots of pieces in this book that come from my life. They're not about my life, but they call up voices, invented details, and stories that grew through language into poems. Sometimes they present or confront things that we all share: death, birth, love, injustice, war, generation. I was born in 1938, and in 1942, the Second World War started, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that war finds its way into the poems in ways that I couldn't have imagined.
Well, tell us, Hilda, about the surprises in this collection as you looked at the juxtaposition of poetry written at different times in your life and career.
I find narrative arcs that shock me just as life circumstances shock me. For example, my two sons, John and Aaron, and I all have the same scar on our chest. How likely is that? The surgeries are very different from one another, but when we appear, we would appear before you with the same scar. Family scars. The Sarah poems in my book, in the collected, the Sarah poems are so filled with received stories about mothers and daughters. And then the Aaron poems, some of which carry my resistance to his choices, are very different. How is it possible? For those of you who don't know, Aaron Raz is my son. He was born to me. I was there as Sarah. There are layers of received wisdom in the book that obscure truth. And sometimes it takes us a very long time through art to discover the truth or the truths. The generosity of strangers, for example, everywhere is the generosity of strangers, civility, and always conflict. And as I mentioned, war.
Well, it's impossible, of course, for us today to give the breadth of this book, but we have chosen 6 poems to share with you. And the first one is called Jan's Orchard, Nebraska, which Hilda will read for us. And we were struck in the poem by the pre-COVID intimacy of spending time with people until everyone is in the same flow pattern in person, as we used to do often. Hilda sees this as a vision, such an easy closeness that we once took for granted.
This is set in Stella, Nebraska. Jan's Orchard, Nebraska. This is from my first book, my first ever book. Anything anyone human might want of an evening, we've carried from the hold of the station wagon parked at the foot of the hill. We loll on the grass and drink. A spring orchard in Stella, even the blasted trees blooming, pear, cherry, and apple, and we're eating a picnic supper and drinking wine in the middle under an umbrella of blossoms. The sun at the horizon catches rose in our glasses. We say nothing. If the good life is coming to us in our lifetime, surely it is here in this orchard in April at twilight. Everything possible blooming, the air impossible warming as the sun goes down. Everything here is becoming summer if we let it. 3 people who try hard to drink and keep this air down on the ground among grass blades while it bubbles and rises and floats us finally, our pale quilts and jackets, our jokes and stories into the night sky, shrinking and whirling us higher and higher until we're dust motes. No lightning points, no star folds, nothing around us cold, nothing around us. No, we are nothing but sighing over the flowers.
That's wonderful, Hilda.
That's part of a poem that I wrote in a series. Long ago, the NEA was sponsoring artists in the schools. Some of you may remember that. And I was hired as a poet in the schools. At the University of Nebraska, we had 6 weeks off for what they called consulting. And I would go for 6 weeks, not at a time, separated into outstate Nebraska communities. I was sent usually to the more difficult communities where the students and the teachers were not familiar with poetry, nor did they want to be. But I think they sent me because I was older, because I was unflappable at that time. And I loved doing it. And so I was very happy to be there in Stella, Nebraska with two people I met. I'd never met them before, Jan and Andy. Oh, and I should say that Andy bought Jan for her birthday this orchard of mixed fruit trees. It was extraordinary.
Yes, nice to get the orchard in there since it's in the
Yes.
title.
Yes.
Well, the next poem that we're going to read together is a continuation of Hilda's outstate Nebraska teaching. It's called Drought, Teaching, Benedict, Nebraska.
Merce says, it don't do to get too attached to any of them. Her grandson, for example, he's 4. You might lose them. In 1972, she come home from town, some fool party or other, to find her husband lying on the floor under the kitchen table. You can't hide from me, she said. I can see your feet. But he didn't move.
Nothing worse than that, except the tornado come right after. Her sister's driving out of town after dropping her off on the porch. Their car stuck. Must have been a swirl in the middle of that wind. The vacuum that kept them stock still, though the tires rolled. She could see it until they drove loose inches only farther south and got away. Meantime, she called Mama 2 houses down.
When the neighbors seen Ma running in the road, she come too. Then the kids from the farm and Judy from York, her girl, just back from the hospital with tonsils, wrapped up in a quilt, like the doctor said. We all went into the storm cellar, and Juddy, my oldest, insisted on pushing up the door just as the funnel passed so his boys could see it go. David's still on the kitchen floor. They wouldn't let me touch him before the doctor. And all of us there for half an hour till it passed. The sheriff's men stationed, 1 at each corner of the section to watch for the ambulance.
Later on the porch with the family all around, all afternoon I leaned over the railing and heaved and gagged. Just nerves was all it was. I hope I don't have to go through that again. But that's what a life's for, I guess. They say the Lord don't put more on a soul than she can bear.
Merce fills my cup with good Swede coffee, starts the breakfast dishes. She's 80, and I'm just up from an operation, come from Lincoln to teach my first poetry writing class this spring. The gray sky promises rain, and believe me, we need it. Drink up, she says, and I do. I'm sorry, that just got me so much. Merce was just the same age as I am now. And I had had a big surgery and didn't have a lot of strength. But those people in the community, the people took you in. They took you in. They told you their stories. They introduced you to their progenitors. They answered your questions and they fed you. And that's a story Merce told me. I excused myself not long after and went into my room and wrote it down.
Yeah. Well, the harshness of rural life is shown here so powerfully. The fragility of the land and of life. I mean, these people are just at the mercy, especially of the wind and weather.
I was so amazed. Also, you hear that they all live, the whole family lives in a community. And they're all there. And the sheriff's men are at each they own a section that's a small farm. And Merce is a retired teacher too.
Yeah.
So I think about these people with such reverence and affection.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm very touched by a new poem in the volume called Nobody teaches life anything. It's the voice of someone who has lived life and sees the trajectory of her life with clear eyes. The unforeseen is here in this poem, as is the knowledge that so much lies beyond our control. Would you read this poem for us, Hilda?
If I can find it, I will.
It's 425, page
Okay, oh, it's later in the book. Okay.
Yeah.
425, I've got it. Okay, this poem is dedicated to John Link, my son, who is a composer. There's a new book coming out about Elliott Carter's work. And he recommended to me that I read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whom I did read and love. And that quote is the title is from him. Nobody teaches life anything. Are you nobody too? Dickinson asked. I didn't want to be nobody, but I was. Put to bed at a certain time for ages, then sent to bed by myself. I ate what they did. A lazy student, I sucked up escape in storybooks. Nobody taught me except how to read and swim. I'm somebody now, but not available to teach life anything. Sorry, what do I know? The fragments that flash? Papa casting his fishing weights in an arc over the yellow rings at Cobb's Hill Pond? To stand and push hard on the pedals of my bike to fly? My brother's big hand in my little one, mother's green brooch, the white silk sheath dress I wore under graduation robes, don't tell. Shortly before my being banished, the shower moved in an arc down. My hip broke. Thereafter followed many months of limping. Life didn't stop. Did you think it would? I'm a good teacher, but as that famous writer said, nobody teaches life anything. Life keeps moving, an infinity pool falling invisibly over some edges. While I'm waiting for an edge, summer unfolds her largesse. Today, a golden skink wriggled his body over the welcome mat. Walking a gravel road with a cane, I saw a rabbit race one side to the other. He was just born, that tiny. Are these chapter lessons from life? I'd like to teach life how to stop Job's brain cancer. But that's the point, isn't it? Life knows everything and doesn't care or can't stop. As we're learning to see edges, life keeps flowing and going and racing and pulsing, and best to do is to keep eyes and ears open for hints of what's coming. Or maybe the point is spring's plenitude, which includes sugar ants and roaches. And, well, you get it, an infinite dub puzzle. Life knows everything from birth to war to building a wall that comes down and goes up, comes down and goes up again. Maybe I'm moseying around time's pool in my coral swimsuit, watching for death to put his booted foot over the lip of, no, not the pool, but my bedroom window, coming in without asking when I was 6. I talked him out of taking me then. He promised to come back later, not wait forever.
Wonderful. Yeah.
You'll find many references to that experience when I was little, when death came wearing a tuxedo, and I talked him out of taking me.
As only a 6-year-old can.
Yes.
Yeah, just terrific. Another poem that we're going to read, and we're going to read this one together, is an example of one of Hilda's story poems, for those of you who know her prior book, List and Story. It's called Another Story. It's a new poem that was published in ABQ imprint number 3, the Myth and Magic issue.
And written for it.
And written for it. This myth you will recognize. It started out as Leta and the Swan, and a number of women poets have modernized and rewritten this poem. So Hilda, you want to say anything about the poem before we read it?
Yes, we all remember Leta and the Swan. The swan was Zeus in disguise as a large swan, and the egg that hatched as Helen of Troy was the egg that came from this unlikely union. But I wanted to look at it not from Leta's perspective or that great William Butler Yeats poem, Leta and the Swan, but I wanted to look at it from the cygnets, the children, the fluffy cygnets point of view. And that's what I did. Let me just stop here for a minute to thank Lynn. Lynn wrote this and put the script to all of this. And I'm so grateful to her for her friendship and for her artistry.
Thank you, Hilda. Okay, so here we go with another story. Or was it so awful to be a disloyal daughter? The cygnets wondered aloud to themselves twice at least a day.
A clutch of females they were, wondering where their daddy went on his day off.
He told them to stop with the pestering,
Preening his chest feathers with his beak where the shafts were broken off.
he smelled funny.
And his song rasped.
Later, when they were fledged, they circled around him.
Time for truth. Where do you go?
Swans were notorious for silence, and their dad no different.
Did you guess there's a human girl, Leta, 2 counties away past the big redwood? So succulent, even the tips of her fingers dripped nectar.
Her nape was reddened, her belly rounding.
Grain grew in her footsteps as she came running to the pond where their father landed for the weekend.
Were they disloyal?
No, they grew up scanning the ripples of their own pond, looking for a way to grow their plumage into regal garments.
Feather underwear to attract the attention of a human god, ready to lay the egg of Helen of Troy, ready to cover her calcite housing with their warmth until she hatched. Yeah, that's a wonderful addition to the Leta canon of poems, I think.
Well, sexuality and pride comes in very different ways. This poem was published in List and Story. It was just a year ago that Amanda hosted our reading from List and Story, and Sandy's holding it up. Thank you. It's my favorite book, but it took a decade to write. It's my favorite book of my books. It took 10 years to write. And those of you who were at the reading know that I'm always driven to write poems that either are lists that open themselves to the readers and invite readers to carry on with their own lists, or stories that have an ending and come closed. So List and Story was the name of the file for the poems on my computer, and I see a lot of poets in the audience. But I'll tell you, when it came time to send it in for publication, I tried to change the title, but I couldn't. It is List and Story. And I write poems, as Rachel Hoddes said in a magnificent article not too long ago, that she comes at poems sideways, but I usually do the lists and stories first.
Well, it's terrific. The next poem is called Spring Snowstorm. This poem is a magical transformation from the accumulation of everyday detail, including snow. Life, like snow, can disappear and it can dazzle. Spring Snowstorm. Each hour of day fills excessive and pure with snowfall through the eyes of windows. All color spills down the walls of each room. The bird bath has a cap of 20 inches, and still snow is coming, and the light grayer under the pines and spruces out the east window. The swings are quiet under the swings are quiet under a pile of ash white. Under this snow gathering itself in ditches, in hollows of needle fists where robins already have begun to build, the earth must be inflamed. Yet I can't see it, only the stasis of the ground beneath the movement of snow falling. This day is the first day of spring. Snow falls through the hours of the day long after the hours of the night, and we have been told snow will fall still for another slice of time, up to the pickets of the far yard and beyond. This first day of spring, someone is 5 years old, someone else is 7. And the one whose words I have been reading all afternoon, the one whose flesh is falling from his bones somewhere in Ohio, his voice is speaking. The flakes are tiny now in the gathering cold. The veils, wind flings over the junipers, merge into a milky silk. All day I have been sitting and reading the words of students who themselves are playing at soldiers in the drifts, ordering their lives with snowmen and pizza, beer, and whatever touching they do. For a few hours alive in this excessive and pure place, snow comes and comes, replacing the sight of earth in spring with layers of wet. If I refuse to breathe, I can hear the germination of wild carrot in the ditches outside of town. If I refuse to breathe, all beauty will be cold and remade forever.
Thank you.
That's a perfect poem for the April that we're having right now. We had some snow in the mountains today.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that this is something you do so well in your poems. We have an everyday detail like the accumulation of snow, but it becomes magical in your poem through the repetition and the visions of what the snow is doing and what different people are doing as the snow is falling. That's such a gift that you have.
Well, I felt it was a gift that the Nebraska skies gave to me because I sat there in one of the spring Nebraska snowstorms in a room filled with light and no artificial light. And the poem was a gift. I didn't change a word. The rhythm of the poem was inside of me, and I just wrote it down. And there aren't too many of those poems, you poets know, that happen in that way, but I've never read that poem out loud. And thank you, Lynn, for choosing it and reading it. I'm grateful.
Well, it does make us feel like we're right there. We're part of that group experiencing the snow. I just want to point out that that poem is from her book, All Odd and Splendid.
Thanks.
Before we go to questions and comments, Hilda will read the title poem of this collection, Letter from a Place I've Never Been. Any preface before you read this, Hilda?
Well, I would just say that this poem is an ars poetica. We all write them. And why do we write? Why do we write? This is one of the poems, and there are lots of them, but not so many in my work, in which time folds over and we are experiencing past, present, and future at the very moment the poem is written. Letter from a Place I've Never Been. Where cold was supposed to be, the sun is warm. You've promised no wind. The grass is calm under the snow. The map showed the interior, which is where I am. The trip was long. I knew it would be. From the top of the earth, I saw no mountain, though you promised if the air was clear, the mountain would show. But ribbons of light swirled the vault of the sky. The sun set at 4, the sun rose at 9. Moose and sled dogs, exotic creatures, I thought to discover around some corner or other by the salmon processing plant. Never. I brought my sunscreen for a tromp through the woods. No woods, no trees, flat rock that seemed to be granite. Alaska is as far from where I am tonight as Chicago is from Seattle, where the layover is long. Or to put it another way, the way of a friend, the distance from LA to New York, a trip I've taken. I'm scared of the cold, of the dark, of the journey, the unfamiliar plants that perk into poems I've read and reviewed. Some kind of weed, not jewel weed from Robert Frost. Oh, why did I say I'd travel? The tundra is something strange, like a sponge, and golden. Oh, why did I say I'd travel? The tundra is something strange, like a sponge, and golden.
Wonderful, Hilda. You know, in a way, all poems are letters from places the poet has never been. I love that title because the act of writing takes us to a place we've never been every single time.
This speaks so much to collaboration because Kwame Dawes wanted to call this book The Poetry of Hilda Raz. And I said, Kwame, you can't do that. It's so pretentious and it sounds exactly like a critical study. He would not be persuaded, but at long last he had some ideas and he sent me a list of probably 10 titles. And Aaron helped me, as he often does, to choose one. And this is the one I chose. And then Kwame wrote about it in the introduction. He likes the title. And I hadn't really seen that poem as central to the book, but it became central. And thanks, Lynn, for choosing it.
Wonderful. Well, let us move now to comments or questions from those of you who are here. Things you'd like to ask or say.
Okay, here's one from Linda. Linda Miller. Hilda, would you talk a bit more about the importance of sounding your poems?
Of those people who've worked with me in workshops, poets workshops, writers workshops, where I've been a part of the group, are always amazed at the way I begin. I don't see anything. I only hear things. And everything that I write it begins with sound. Thanks for asking that question, Linda. I hope that there's substance in the poems, but they are about sound in some generative way.
All righty, our next question is from Julie Dunlap. Hey, Julie, are you there?
Julie.
Hey there, yes. Thank you, Hilda, so much for your reading. It's just wonderful to this tremendous gift that you have given to us, to the universe. And I was thinking about the first poem you read, and you mentioned that it was from your very first collection.
Yes.
And I just wonder if you could share a little bit perhaps about how it has felt to look back on your early work, the relationship you feel between the early work and maybe how you chose which poems to include and which ones maybe to leave out when you were creating this wonderful work for us.
Oh, thanks for the question, Julie. I have a list from a lecture I gave a couple weeks ago. Actually, what is good? What was I thinking of? But that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to make a comprehensive list of what was good in the universe, because all I could feel was what wasn't good. And so I was going to chisel out and isolate what is good. That was my desire, to define the abstraction good in terms of concrete, a list of concrete things. And that's what that poem is, the title poem of that book. That book was chosen by the poetry editor of Grove Press at the time, Robert Pack, for publication in the Grove Press series. And some of you have heard me tell this story. Arnie Rossett sold Grove Press while my book, it wasn't even in press. It was in the queue. And what could I do? Nothing. I was glad to have that acceptance, but Bob Peck helped me, and that book fell into two pieces. The part that was published as What is Good by Eloise Fink, who had a press called Thorntree Press in Chicago, in Evanston, actually. And then the chapbook, which was called The Bone Dish. And that book, that chapbook, The Bone Dish, Judith Kitchen edited. And she, yes, exactly. Sandy is, and I will do that too, because she was the most extraordinary editor and writer. I mean, we know her as a writer and critic, and she died way too soon. Anyway, but a lot of major poets of my generation were first published by State Street Press in that chapbook series. And there's a scholar in the audience who wants a great project. And Stan Rubin, who is still alive and a wonderful poet, helped Judy with this press, or maybe it was his idea. And they were in Brockport. And yeah, so I was glad to have the two pieces published. And they had a very different order. But then the University of Nebraska Press came to me, and I don't have that book here. They've just brought this book out again. They wanted to publish the original book. What was that book called? It was called something like That's Everything. I mean, it was just one of these. It had a grandiose title, but Nebraska published it again in its original Grove Press form. And they've just brought it out again. They brought out all my books again. Now, April 1st, every one, including the amazing memoir that Aaron Breslink, this is Aaron's story. I showed it to you before. It is an extraordinary book. My part in this book, in this book, I'm not the poet. I am not the critic, not the teacher, not the citizen. I am only the parent. And so you get the second part is me talking in prose. It's essays. Well, I more than answered your question, Julie. Thank you. Thank you for asking it.
All right, thank you, Julie. And now Jeff wants to hear a little bit more about how you start with sound, which I think is good. I feel like maybe you shortened that, and I think that maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, Hilda.
It's surprising to know that I'm a formalist, because most of my work is looks to be in free verse, although you can't publish. Yeah. But I feel the way vowel sounds not only hook up but modulate through a line. And that's the way the first line will sound in my head. And then I will take the subject the sound is embodied in, and I then have either a list or a story, or more importantly, the poems that are in list and story, that are narrative fragments that go together. But I'm always following the sounds, mostly vowel sounds, but also mutes. Well, I don't want to get into technical stuff, it's boring, but all this stuff lives in my body in some way, and has since I was a very small child. Thanks, Jeff, for asking. I don't know if that's too abstract an answer, but it's the best.
I think that's good. A lot of these people are writers, so I think you can venture into the technical.
And this is less operative when I write essays. For years, I published 2 books at a time, a book of poems and a book of essays, or a critical study of prose. And it's not so operative in my prose, but yeah.
Okay, let's see. We've got one here from Sharon Warner. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks for being here.
She would like to know a little bit about your mentors, especially with your poetry work. Who first inspired you to write poems in particular?
Well, I've been writing poems since most poets have since they were children. I'm thinking about Maxine Kumin, who, well, I won't go into that. Anyway, I have always written poems, and by poems I mean any writing in the short line. When you are impelled to smash a line break rather than carrying your writing out to the edge of the page, you're a poet. And I always knew that poetry was the form that I found most compelling. Robert Lowell was my first famous mentor, but Earl Remington, who was my high school teacher and let me graduate, he talked his colleagues into letting me graduate from high school after I had left in my junior year, if I could pass my final exams. Earl Remington liked my writing, and I did pass my finals and I did graduate. But at Boston University, where I went to college, Robert Lowell was teaching a graduate poetry seminar. And someone suggested to me that I might like to study with Robert Lowell. Well, I was a freshman. How was I going to study with Robert Lowell? But I made an appointment to talk to him, and he looked at my poems and he said, yeah. So there I was studying with Robert Lowell at Boston University as an undergraduate in his graduate poetry seminar, and the same seminar that Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath had taken not so many years before me. And that was an extraordinary experience, but that seminar was extraordinary because Robert Lowell was writing the poems in Life Studies, and Life Studies was the book that changed contemporary poetry. A single book changed contemporary poetry. And Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath, who had been studying with Lowell, two very different poets, though they were friends, I am convinced, though I haven't seen any critics say so, that Lowell learned from them. He'd already won the Pulitzer for these highly formal poems. He was writing life studies, and he would bring these poems into class. He would read, we would read. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. And so that set me on the way. Robert Pack, who's a wonderful poet, still alive, and extraordinarily generous. He ran Breadloaf Writers Conference at that time. And Bernice Sloat, who was the editor of Prairie Schooner, who was another mentor, probably the most important mentor I've ever had, sent me to Breadloaf because Willie Cather, and Bernice Sloat was the first Willie Cather scholar, though some people might disagree, but I was there. I know she and her wife, Virginia Faulkner, started Willie Cather studies. And Bernice, with the money from Prairie Schooner money, English department money, sent me to Breadloaf because Willie Cather had gone there. And there I met Robert Peck. I went not as a student, but as an auditor. I didn't even take work. I was so lowly. And because of Robert Peck's generosity, and Carol Ols, I believe, is here too. She and I edited The Crumb together, the daily newspaper of Breadloaf. And we met so many incredible writers there. If I began to list them, I would cry because some of them are gone and some of them are not. Judith Ortez Kofer was one Carol and I met at Breadloaf, and I began to publish her work in Prairie Schooner. She died way too soon, but an extraordinary poet, and on and on and on. So, and then my new mentors are here in New Mexico. I write with them, I work with them. And because I edit the Mary Burritt Christensen poetry series for the University of New Mexico Press, all of those books have come in. They are my mentors, the writers of their books. I learn from those books at the same time I'm able to publish them.